Hi everyone, welcome back. Where should we do? Have to stand?
You stand next to each other.
How do I do that?
You can stand far apart. But
we haven't been that close for a while.
Hi everyone, welcome back. So you know me, I'm Miss Andrew Dawson. We are DS1. And this year the studio is called Unfinished Cuba. So we have some other people joining us as tutors. Hannah Durham, who works for Cullinan Studios in London. She'll be coming in. We've got Andy Edwards, who's one of our tech tutors. He's got a practice here in Oxford. And then Francesco Miniati, who works for us in original field of architecture. So the thing about this is we've been running studios on unfinished buildings for the last, this will be our third year of working on this project. And it started by seeing this film, which somebody talked to me about, which was looking at unfinished buildings in Italy. But because they'd already been mapped, I was quite interested in looking at how we would expand that elsewhere. So Andrew and I came up with this Unfinished Athens studio, and we ran that between 2014 and 2015. And we've just produced a book on the studio, and we have an exhibition in Athens on the work that we produced. And what came out of it is a series of strategies about ways of working with unfinished buildings. So part of the way the studios work is that we do field work. We go there, we spend at least a week walking around on sites that we actually find beforehand or ones that we just stumble upon. So when we did Athens, we divided up into 4 different areas, and then students would just go out and kind of use urban exploration to find sites. And this was a project from the 1960s that was incomplete. But essentially most of the stock there was modernist buildings. This was right in the centre of Athens. And then the projects that came out of it were playful. They're about sort of impermanence, short-term strategies, social endeavours to try and regenerate Athens. We worked with different communities there, looking at how to kind of deal with what they were dealing with after the crisis. Things to do with tradition. And also strategies which were constantly in flux. So the idea that you might build something and pull it down, and actually, you know, cycles of design where this thing is never fixed. And the students worked in very different ways, and some of them are in the book, so I might pass it around so you can have a look at that. That brought up this kind of interest in the idea of unfinished buildings in Europe at times of crisis. And so we then moved the studio to Spain last year, where we were looking at the work of economists. It became more trying to understand economies of actually real scarcity in comparison to luxury, because obviously Europe has this kind of tense history between the two.
In both studios, the students were encouraged to understand the construct for which and the context for which the buildings were unfinished and why. And although there is a common thread of them not being complete for a reason, there was a preface of all the social and political and economic reasons why they ended up that way.
So then while in Athens we were looking at individual buildings really, when we moved to the outskirts of Madrid, so we went here for several days, walked around this site, which is Cesena, which you might have heard of because it's near a tyre dump. So it's such a desolate, unfinished site that there was this tyre dump left near it while there are people living in this mass housing. They call it ghost urbanisation in Madrid. But this was set on fire on the night of the exhibition, actually. Andrew saw it as a momentous thing, celebrating the exhibition opening. But it was horrific because it was this sort of toxic waste. But in essence, we walked around there and another site, which was this one at Valdeluz. So these have been sites where nothing has happened. They've just been stuck dead, with people living in them with nobody in the streets. And these projects took on different kinds of strategies about reuse, recycling. Andy Edwards did something on farming resources. We looked a lot at super use, how to kind of resource fill sites. This was a project by Josh Aylett. But then other people worked with video and films, again with temporality, dealing with the critique of modernism. And then also exploring the whole thing which has been coming out of research-led design since 2008, which are other ways of producing drawings, other ways of working as architectural research. This was by Chris Jones, deconstructing these big modernist grids. I think, because Marcel asked me then to write a chapter on all of this work that we've been doing for a book he and Aileen are putting together, and I'm giving a lecture on Wednesday on that. But it made me sort of really sit down and consolidate on what this research is in the studio. And it's about really how architects engage with capitalism. You know, what are we doing? How are we working in this system? We participate in things. You know, what's our responsibility? How much control do we have? Do we have any? How do we design in strategies? So we're building in a different direction to go to Cuba, because the person that put me onto Unfinished Italy is an Italian in Portugal who I met. And he suggested I move the project to Cuba, because obviously there are a lot of unfinished buildings there, but unfinished buildings that are now ruins. And I think it's interesting because the last two studios were looking at a kind of very contemporary moment of crisis in Europe. Once we move here, I think there's a whole other series of agendas which come up with how do we work in you know, other situations. Do you want to comment on that?
The political and social context for Cuba is completely different to Athens and Madrid. And I think that's quite interesting, is how you engage with that. And we've had a bit of advice, and it's very important to not get distracted by the political ideology, but rather focus on the specifics of how people responded within the city to this, to the historical political context. So that's something we will be focusing on. The political ideology will always be in the background, but the focus is really on about the city and how people live and work within the city.
So again, it's kind of interesting because we've got this real style mixture, whereas in the other European cities there was much more precincts of just whole modern buildings. There's going to be more of a mixture, I think, here. But also, you know, people talk about frozen sites in Havana. And then the whole of the old Havana is kind of, you know, a lot of it seems to have unfinished bits in it. So we're going to again be using these strategies of fieldwork, photography, video, interviewing people, connecting with people in the areas. And students will themselves find sites as big or as small as you want to then understand, so that you can use it as the premise for your project. The interesting thing I think about Cuba, Joelle in the office was talking to Andrew about it, is this massive urban farming strategy that they have, which is as an island in order to be self-sufficient after the kind of detachment from Russia. There was this whole rationing of food and it having to become self-sufficient. So some of the most significant urban farming strategies are happening in Cuba itself. And I've been in contact with a few organisations there to see if we can talk to them about how that's happening. But it's right in the centre of Havana, from what I can gather. So I'm hoping to sort of arrange a talk or meet with some of the people who are working. And there's many, many groups that are working on it. Then there's a film called Unfinished Spaces, which I found. So I wrote to the director, she lives in LA, and she put me in touch. It's the study of this building, which is an unfinished art school in Havana. And actually she's going to now do a Skype chat and be part of a documentary series at Brooks, which will be quite nice. But she put me in touch with this guy who's an artist, and he knows a lot of kind of architects who had designed buildings which were stilted due to political changes, and so has offered to kind of line us up with people to either see exhibitions of their work, talk to them. Clearly there's going to have to be some understanding of the whole political history. So this is photographs of the revolution from 1959. But I think the imagery, the kind of things, the visuality of it really interests me as well, in terms of it being in between times. And then the other thing we're going to, this is one of the second things we'd like to do, is focus on stories about this kind of peculiar scenario in Havana. And this one I thought I just stumbled on, which is quite interesting, which is an American government building, which they decided in the 1980s that they were going to just put up these kind of propaganda statements about what they thought Cubans should do. So they would put up messages about what they thought, and people were protesting. And what they decided to do was set up things which would block it, but in the end they turned the power off. So I think this kind of spatial construct of when you're fighting against a kind of capitalist ideology and where you position yourself is quite interesting. There are some extraordinary stories about how people try to locate themselves within their cultural history there. The other stuff is this book's just come out by Peggy Deemer. I met her last year. I thought she was fantastic. She's just great. She's a real kind of lefty. And she's just put this book out about immaterial labour and politics. And it talks about other ways that you might be creative in architecture. So it's all about practice. And Philippe has offered to work with us. He's got a studio space. He works on invisible drawing practices. Maybe that's something we do with him. I don't know yet. The other thing is Francesco wants to look at using photogrammetry while we're on site to try to get kind of realistic versions of these things. But I love this incompleteness, even in this imagery. So, you know, this idea of kind of uber-realism, but then how real do we want to go? And the other thing I think in DS1, this was a drawing by Isabel Molle last year, who we taught. Well, it was a 900 by 900 thing. You might have seen it at the exhibition. But it's a kind of exchange between text, fantasy propositions, the unfinished. A kind of, it was the very first thing she did in week 1. And I like this exchange between architectural thinking, because some people say, oh, you know, you don't need to write or think in architecture. I kind of think you do. And it's not just about what that proposition is, it's an exchange between the two of them. So we're kind of, you know, interested in as much theoretical research and finding out about things, knowing about them as the propositions. But also working in alternative modes of practice and lots of making of stuff.